I'm Mario Vaz. Um, I'm, I look after this museum, which is named after Major General Bhatia. Major General Bhatia was a professor of physiology and the first Indian Dean of Grant Medical College in Bombay. And it was a time when divisions between disciplines in medicine were not so stringent. So his appointment was actually as the professor of physiology and hygiene. And so he was responsible for looking after the whole city of Bombay in the aftermath of the plague, which had happened, just at around the turn of the century. When he retired, he came to Bangalore. And he tried over a period of 4 years to set up an institute of the history of medicine. He had his property in Nandidurg Road. He offered it to the state government. He had a collection which he had over a lifetime. He offered that to the state of Mysore at that time. And nothing came to fruition. And finally, at the end of 4 years, he had to withdraw his offer. St. John's had started. We had a founder dean who was a remarkable educationist as well as very passionate about the history of medicine and about what I, without touching any raw nerves, would call scholarly pursuits beyond the individual disciplines. So as the dean of the medical college, he was actually responsible for obtaining for St. John's some of the exhibits which you have in this museum. But the core of the museum is the collection of Major General Bhatia. We've had talks of various kinds going through this museum walks, but today's museum walk is about about history and ethics. And we decided to do this because day after tomorrow is World Bioethics Day, and that was a day that was recognized by UNESCO, and we were recently made a UNESCO unit of bioethics. The person who heads that is Olinda Timms. She's not here right now. She's in Switzerland writing some paper on surrogacy and the ethics of it. But we had decided to have this walk in advance. So here I am, all right, to take you through to S.L. Bhatia's museum. And along the way, please feel free to talk. There are people who are ethicists among you all. There are people who have various interests. So we can have this as a discussion as we go along. But I thought I'd start off with something which is... So for me, since I'm embedded in this museum so much, every picture speaks to me. There is a story behind every single thing. And obviously we can't do that today. But I am going to stop along at specific points. And so in 1934, we had the formation of the Medical Council of India. It was not the Medical Council of India that we know today. It had a lot of very illustrious, very committed people. It was an institution which actually people felt was going to change the face of medical education in India. And it had its origins in an act in 1916 called the Indian Medical Council Act, which had to deal with innumerable medical institutions in India. There were medical colleges, there were medical schools. Some were giving degrees which were licentiates in 3 years, some were offering a vernacular licentiate, some were more aligned to the British system and were offering the MBBS. And India had to make sense of all this. And the General Medical Council in Britain had passed a diktat saying, if you don't get your house in order, there are so many provinces, so many presidencies, and if you don't get it all together, then we'll have to de-recognize your courses. And so the Medical Council of India was started with some really, really remarkable people. They were educationists in every sense of the word. If you want, you can pass it around. You will see Major General Bhatia there. And I thought I would make reference to that particular thing because, you know, we are still at the stage where medical ethics is not formally recognized by the Medical Council of India within the medical curriculum. And yet, ironically, in 1955, India, newly independent India, institutes a medical education conference in Delhi under the Ministry of Health. The person who chairs this meeting is Amrita Kaur. And the person who addresses the meeting, the very first person, is Jawaharlal Nehru. Key to this meeting is Dr. B.C. Roy. And among the issues that they discuss at that time is the issue of starting medical ethics in the curriculum in India. This was in 1955. This was way before the American medical schools thought about medical ethics. It was even before the schools in the United Kingdom thought about it. But this was a meeting which was marred by many, many issues. The board committee had sent in its report in 1946. There was this whole notion that we had to create a social physician, preventive and social medicine needed to have its rightful place. And there was a huge disparity in the medical course, the curriculum. There were some medical colleges in India which had 1,400 hours of anatomy, others which had 300, all right? And the conference had to deal with all of this. And so sadly, although this was tabled, this was discussed in this conference, the last two sentences of that section read, no resolutions were taken. And I think it was a really tragic moment for medical education in India because it was a lost opportunity. It was an opportunity to do many other things. They did try to do many things. There were many things which came into this document which we actually, so for instance, the fact that people had to go out during community health and work, spend time in villages and all that decisions were taken at this point in time. But medical ethics fell by the wayside. And that's the story of why we don't have it, and we continue to discuss why we should have it. Sunita, please interrupt whenever you want, okay? Because I think we can have her. So can we just shift, because I'm going to go from place to place, and whenever you want to stop, please stop me. By the way, Major General Bhatia in 1918 was the only medical doctor in the First World War that year to receive the Military Cross. And he won the Military Cross because he refused to abandon his medical post in the face of withering enemy fire. Alright? So, although I often tell people that I'm the caretaker of this museum, I don't think Bhatia needs me to speak for him. Alright? It'll be a tragedy if the museum disappears, but I think he will not be forgotten. This section of the museum deals with ancient and evolving medicine. And again, I will not go through many of the beautiful stories that I can tell you. Here on this panel, we have the ancient Greek god Asclepius, alright, and you can see him with his staff and the Asclepian stake, alright. People who in ancient Greece enter the temples of Asclepius to be healed. And in these temples, you have these non-poisonous snakes. They were called Asclepian snakes, which would actually go around. People spent the night in the temple. And all along the temple, you would have terracotta votive offerings. These are in wax. But you would have terracotta votive offerings. So if a person had a problem with their hand, they would come with a votive offering of their hand. and they would spend time in the temple of Asclepius, and they would leave. The interesting thing, and some of you all know this because you all have heard me before, is that here comes in the first ethical dilemma of medical education. Asclepius had sons and daughters, and it was only his daughters who became physicians. And yet, the system that evolved in the West evolved so that it became entirely male dominated. Hygeia, whom we after hygiene, Panacea, were all both his daughters. All right, and it clearly shows that in ancient Greece, as in ancient Egypt, women had an integral part in healthcare, and it was only later when the gender imbalance came to the fore, and women were denied multiple rights, including the right to be educated, that they stopped getting formally educated, although through the centuries, the physicians to the people continued to be women. They were the herbalists, they were the midwives, they were the people who treated the majority of the people in the community. In the ancient Greco-Roman tradition, of course, we have Hippocrates, who is often considered the father of Western medicine, and we have another person called Galen, who is often considered the villain of Western medicine, I think very unjustly. Hippocrates we know because, if not anything else, we keep referring to the Hippocratic Oath. The Hippocratic Oath was not a creation of Hippocrates. It actually came out of the Pythagorean school after Hippocrates died. But there is no doubt that it incorporated into the oath a lot of the material that can be derived from the aphorisms of Hippocrates. Hippocrates was a rationalist. He wanted people to observe what was happening with disease and make decisions accordingly. And although today we feel that's very common and it should be something that we should accept quite easily, at that time it wasn't so, because people believed in religious and spiritual healing. And here was a man saying, chart the course of illness, see what happens, all right? And so if you look at his case histories, you will see these notations being made day by day as a patient progresses, often till death. But he felt that it was necessary for him to document that to make sense. Galen was very strongly influenced by Hippocrates. He came much later. And he was a vociferous writer. He was a physician to the gladiators. He wrote innumerable volumes on medicine. And for 15 centuries in Western Europe, Galen became the dogma of Western medicine, and that is why he is so vilified. He never asked anyone to follow what he wrote, by the way. The fact that people chose to do it is a different matter. He also wrote on ethics, what was the medical doctor to be. And one of the things which we must understand with history is that it's easy for us to look back in time and say, oh, look at this, why did they do this? It's so obvious today. And in fact, there's a very nice rhyme about medical ethics, which I've forgotten, but there is a line which says that every point vice has worn a victor's crown, all right? Just to tell us that ethics has evolved over time, and what was considered unethical at one point in time was considered, quite unethical at a different point. So Galen writes about the physician and his roles as a physician. He's very clear. A physician must be noble. A physician must put himself beyond, common things. And yet he was a man who engaged in public vivisection of animals, obviously without anesthesia, to demonstrate to the common populace in the public square that this is what the insides of an animal looked like. And then from those extrapolated to derive the anatomy of the human being, which he got horribly wrong. All right. As we move in through the period of the Renaissance, the Middle Age, here you see a floor plan of an early medieval monastery, and you can see that people who were brought into the monastery were brought into an infirmary, which was a part of the church and which was separated from the chancel, which is the Holy of Holies, by a curtain. And the people were brought and put on pallets here. By then, herbs had already been described as having medicinal properties. So these monasteries always had herb gardens. And then when the prayers were being sung or said, the curtains would be pulled aside and the people would be able to gaze into the Holy of Holies. Was this successful? It probably was to some extent, because their nutritional status improved when they were here. The hygiene conditions were more hygienic, and they had the benefit of some herbs. But whether they constituted the 85% who would normally in any case get healed, no one will know. I'm going to talk about two specific people here. The first is James Lind, all right? In medical history, people who do clinical trials, he's recognized as the person who conducted the first clinical trial on board the ship HMS Salisbury. It was known at that time that scurvy was rampant. When Magellan went around, circumnavigated the earth, he lost about 70 to 80% of his sailors during that circumnavigation. Not all to scurvy, but the vast majority to scurvy. And it was not uncommon when the Portuguese discovered the Cape of Good Hope and then sailed up the Indian Ocean with the monsoon winds, that they lost about 30% of their sailors due to scurvy. It's also well known that when the East India Company brought their ships to India, part of what the doctor of the ship was asked to keep was a fresh supply of citrus fruit. So this was before Lind. So it was not that they didn't know. They knew. But these were mercantile companies, and they had little need to share that information with anyone else. Why allow other people to successfully travel along the seas when the success of your mission depended on the maximum number of sailors reaching the ports after a long voyage? So here Lind performs his famous experiment. He takes 12 sailors, he divides them into 6 groups of 2 each, all right? People today would be appalled at his calculation of sample size, all right? And then he gives them lemons and oranges, elixir of vitriol, vinegar, seawater, an extract of garlic, all right? And what he observes is that the group which receives oranges and lemons recovers dramatically, all right? What many people who cite this experiment do not realize is that Lind wrote a treatise on scurvy, and it's a 350-page treatise. And the person who's written the most definitive study on scurvy, which is Carpenter, all right, has described his book, all right, as difficult, almost painful to read. Lind, all right? And his entire experiment constitutes 5 paragraphs of a more than 350-page book. All right? Now, questions remain. Some of them are ethical. After he gave the oranges and lemons to the 2 who recovered, there is no mention whether, having seen their dramatic recovery, whether he gave it to the rest. All right? And did they, in turn, recover? We are also faced with what today we call clinical equipoise, right? When he was making these groups, was he confident that these different groups had an equal chance of being equally likely to succeed? And it's hard to answer that one. We know that everyone knew about limes and oranges and everything else, but we do not know to what extent that actually transmitted itself along other people. I mean, as late as the turn of the 20th century, communication was still low. So, I mean, you have, for instance, the classic example of Landsteiner being accredited with the discovery of the blood groups. And at the very same time, you have two independent researchers, Morris in America and Jansky in Czechoslovakia, who both discover the groups, give them different nomenclatures exactly at the same time without being in communication with each other, and no one knew what they had done. So it's possible that Lind was guided by clinical equipoise. But if he had done such a dramatic study, as we often talk about when we do this, I don't know, Dennis, whether you refer to that, then why is it that it took 40 to 50 years for this to be incorporated into naval practice? And it actually seems to stem from his own doubt about what he was seeing. So in popular view, we all describe, he gave the oranges, they got up and walked, and everything was fine after that. And if you actually read his treatise, which is horrible to read, I mean, you will find that he keeps talking about they need to get fresh air. The ships need to be aerated well. And they should eat their food well. And the biscuit and the dried meat is the substance of the food which sustains all sailors. So till the end, I mean, and he went on to become the chief naval physician. He was not entirely convinced about what he was to do. I'm going to talk about Jenner now, because Jenner, I don't know, you'll teach Jenner as the father of vaccination? Yeah? Okay. So, yes, he is the father of vaccination, but obviously not of variolation, right? The word vaccine derives itself from the Latin word vacca, which means cow, all right, or vache, French derivative, which is cow. And what Jenner did was, of course, his classic, for the sake of those who are not medical, he found that the milkmaids who had developed cowpox rarely, if ever, got smallpox, and so he thought that he could use those the fluid off their little blisters to go and vaccinate another person. Who was the first person that he vaccinated? He vaccinated,
His family.
No, he vaccinated his family member. Later, he vaccinated his own son. But the first person he vaccinated was James Phipp. He was the son of his gardener. Talk about coercion. Talk about whether this was actually completely voluntary without anything. And afterwards, he goes on to vaccinate other people, including his family members and his son. But the other important thing about Jenner is, what did he do? Having vaccinated James Phipps, 1 week later, he subjects him to variolation. That is exposure to smallpox itself. Now, he doesn't develop smallpox, and he proves the point that vaccination has probably worked to prevent smallpox. Question is, was it ethical to variolate? And the answer to that is that variolation, it was probably okay, because variolation was a method that was used to prevent smallpox prior to vaccination. In India, everyone knows about variolation in China. But in India, we had variolation too. And it doesn't come out of a person like me with a false sense of having to be patriotic, all right, and say that we did everything in India first. This is 1767, all right, a treatise or an account of the manner of inoculating for the smallpox in the East Indies, published by J.Z. Holwell, FRS, all right. This is in 1767. And in it he describes that every 7 years in India, as the weather changes, India experiences an outbreak of smallpox. And out of the holy places, including Banaras and others, leave people who have already had smallpox, and they go to the site where smallpox has been recorded. And what they do is they go and visit the people who have had smallpox. They carry with them a linen cloth, a damp linen cloth, and they take up from the pustules the fluid and start applying it on this linen cloth, which they place around their bodies like cummerbunds. And then they go through the villages. Why? Probably to keep it warm. And in the areas where there is an outbreak of smallpox, they ask people whether they would want to receive the mark. And people are aware of their existence, so they come forward. And what they do is they make a mark. They braid the skin, and from this cloth they go and variolate. These are called tikadars. Tikka, the mark, tikadars. And it is a widespread system all along Bengal and even coming down, though not to such a large extent, to South India. But in the larger province of Bengal, the presidency of Bengal, this is a rampant practice. And apparently they are so good by his own accounts that they would even ask them, do you want a low dose or do you want a high dose? They were capable of actually determining how they were going to do. And variolation worked. It did actually protect. Of course, if there were people who died because of variolation. In the case of Jenner, people often argue that he was right to variolate because although the practice of variolation did not come to Britain, there were many people from Britain who actually left Britain when there was a fear of smallpox and came to Turkey. I mean, it was not Turkey at that time, but came to Istanbul because variolation was practiced there so that they could variolate their children and then bring them back to England. No,
what was the time period essentially for SVGs?
See, Hippocrates is around 4th century BC, and we have a problem with Hippocrates because, like Sushruta, we don't have a problem, but I don't have a problem. There's a problem trying to date his works because a lot of what we ascribe to Hippocrates, as we ascribe to Sushruta, is probably something which has been done over several centuries. All right, and in the case of Indian literature, the written word occurred in the 2nd, 3rd century. So, Sushruta, for instance, is dated as 6th century BC. So it's a huge period of about 800 years before we actually.
Just yesterday I read that Rajma came to India through on ships because they needed protein. I don't know how far it's true.
I don't know either. but a lot of what we eat today, of course, came from the West, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we can't do without potato, and it was brought in by the Portuguese, and we can't.
I read that Rajma came from South America because of protein.
It may well be.
And the smallpox vaccine, how they transported it across oceans was through people or animals.
Yes. They maintained the vaccine. That's right. And of course, once it came to India and British India decided to introduce vaccination, they completely wiped out the tikadas. So the indigenous practice of variolation was completely stopped, and people forgot that India had ever been home to variolation.
That's why it's still called tika laga do.
Yeah.
In the injection is tika.
See? So this section is on more modern medicine. It's the age of discovery, not only of instruments but also of the cause of diseases. Among them we have the discovery by Röntgen of X-rays. He was the rector of a college. Like many people who would discover things, he was very clear he didn't want to share his discovery. When he actually felt that he was on the verge of the discovery, he locked the doors, and then he, for 3 weeks, was not seen. He was the rector of the college, so I know what happened to administration. Probably, like St. John's, no decisions were made. But after 3 weeks, he emerges, and he emerges with this X-ray, because the only person that he could trust was his wife. And of course, this is the X-ray of her hand with her wedding ring, all right? And actually an interesting thing happens with that, because X-rays after that become the window to the body. And X-rays become a thing on exhibitions and everything else. But it does lead to a social phenomenon, which I think, although written in jest here, is something which we need to consider, and that is the fact that people suddenly felt that their body space had been invaded. And so you have this from Wilhelmer, the Electrical Review in 1896, exactly 100 years before the development of the sphygmomanometer. And it says, the Röntgen rays, what is this craze? The town's ablaze with the new phase of X-rays ways. I'm full of days, shock and amaze, for nowadays I hear they'll gaze through cloak and gown and even stays those naughty Röntgen rays. And so I think medical discovery did have a social impact as well. And this idea of the body and boundaries, for want of a better word, and where can medicine actually get to you, all right, is something which continues. And it continues actually in a very strange way in this man here. His name is René Théophile Laennec, all right, the man who described the stethoscope. Now, Laennec had lost, I think it was his father, to tuberculosis. And he grew up as a very shy, introverted, sensitive person. There are other beautiful paintings of Laennec, and which actually depict the whole fear of tuberculosis and contagion. You find that Laennec is sitting and near the patient, and everyone is behind chairs and barriers, as though, if some way the contagion, there has to be a barrier between you and contagion. And so the story of Laennec and his discovery of the stethoscope could well be seen also as his discomfort about boundaries between the patient and the doctor. I mean, at that time people knew that you could hear strange sounds. When people had pleurisy, when people had pneumonia, it was common practice for doctors to place their ears on the chest of the patient and to listen to those sounds. They could also hear abnormal heart sounds. And Laennec was one day confronted with a rather buxom lady, and he had to go and examine her, and he was just mortified at the thought. So what he does is he rolls a newspaper. And he's not sure he can hear anything, but he places it against her chest and he listens. And to his surprise, he finds that the sounds actually are transmitted rather well. In fact, if you put your ear, you are exposed to far more direct friction against your ear. which makes it harder for you to listen. And so that was the start of a wooden stethoscope, which was the mono-oral stethoscope. Later, and then the fetoscope, which was used by nurses a lot, and us, yes, I know. Today no one knows what a fetoscope is. You have to buy this online. And then finally the binaural stethoscope, which allowed you to actually listen to something without having to listen to 500 other conversations happening around you, right? So another person at that time who actually changed the face of medicine was Pasteur. All right? Pasteur, of course, was responsible for the germ theory. Before that, you had the whole idea of humors. Everything was defined on the basis of humors. And when Pasteur finally describes germs and then proposes the germ theory, it changes the entire face of medicine, because thereafter people are only going to ascribe disease to germs, and that is going to create a huge problem. All right? Pasteur, of course, goes on to develop the vaccine for rabies, to develop the vaccine for anthrax. But his first vaccination of rabies, that little boy outside the Pasteur Institute in the statue, is done under strange circumstances, because apparently the mother comes to Pasteur and says, "You've got to do something." Remember, Pasteur was the scientist of France. All right? I mean, France hailed him as the greatest thing that had ever happened, perhaps since Lavoisier. Lavoisier was during the French Revolution, and what happened to him? He was guillotined, so much so that people would say it takes generations to find a man like Lavoisier, and a few seconds to get rid of them. All right? But Pasteur is really in a quandary. He's developed a vaccine, he's never tested it in humans, and he has this boy. And he goes and vaccinates the boy, and the boy recovers. And what Pasteur would not have, maybe we would not have known about Pasteur's vaccination so much, all right? But there arises a controversy. Does Pasteur do this for his greater glory? Was he willing to sacrifice everything? Or was he really driven by the motive of actually trying to do something when there was nothing else at hand? The story of this vaccination may have completely died out, but for the fact that 3 children in America were bitten by a rabid dog. They were immediately transported on a ship that sailed the fastest at that time. I don't know how fast it took, to Paris. But they went along with a newspaper reporter. And the newspaper reporter kept sending in messages across the channel, telling the American public what was happening. The children have arrived. The great Pasteur has seen them. He has now decided to vaccinate. It was literally a blow-by-blow account. And they recovered. And once that happened, Pasteur's fate was sealed. He was hailed, and I think rightly so, as one of the greatest scientists of all time. During this period, science also advanced. I'm a physiologist, so bear with me. Right here is one of the many fathers of physiology. We are a strange family structure, all right, because we have many, many fathers. And one of them is Claude Bernard. Claude Bernard was the man who gave us the idea of homeostasis, all right? And it's interesting. I'll just read from thing, because this is, I need to look at my dates, and I can't see. Okay, so he died in 1878. And in his book, An Introduction to the Study of Experimental Medicine, he writes, "Have we a right to perform experiments and vivisections on man? Physicians make therapeutic experiments daily on their patients, and surgeons perform vivisections daily on their subjects. It is our duty and our right to perform an experiment on man whenever it can save him, cure, and give him some personal benefit." And then he goes on to describe, why we should actually conduct experiments and vivisection. And he was a proponent of doing experiments on people who are condemned to death. all right? But this was an area where people were still gaining their understanding of how do we move science forward and how do we conduct experiments when we know that there is a greater good, all right? And today we can look back at some of these things and say, oh, this was ridiculous. I mean, how could they conceivably have done? But let's take a simple disease like pellagra, right? How was the treatment of pellagra discovered? The treatment of pellagra was discovered here by Goldberger, all right? He was a medical officer of the United States Public Health Service. He was sent to, given this task of determining the treatment for pellagra. And he came in to an existing idea, the McFadden report, which said pellagra is caused by an infectious disease. Now, Goldberger had a problem with that because he could see that there were, for instance, orphanages where the orphans had pellagra and their carers didn't. So he said that can't possibly be right. So he goes to an orphanage and he conducts this experiment. He gives them the nutritious food, he gives them a whole range, a variety of diet, and pellagra disappears. He removes it, and 1 year later there are relapses. He goes to a mental asylum and does the same. But there is this very strong view that this is not the reason why they've improved. Where is the infectious cause of pellagra? And so Goldberger then goes on to do something which today we would have to debate on the ethicality of it. He conducts filth parties. He says if it is really due to infections, then let's get to the heart of it. He takes blood from these people, he injects them into the deltoids of other people, including himself and his wife. They use excretions of people with pellagra, mix it into the food. They get violently sick, but no one dies of pellagra. No one gets pellagra. But it is a long time before his ideas are actually accepted. All right. I raise these issues because we have to ask ourselves. There are many experiments where we say we will not accept the experiments because they were done under dubious conditions or they were not done under ethical conditions. But we actually are confronted with a whole lot of things which we accept, which we have to think about. I mean, I'm not saying, I don't believe that we can sit in judgment today about what happened. Goldberger did his experiments in 1914, so a century ago. But they nevertheless were the basis on which we found out. We found out the cause of beriberi because of prison camps in the Dutch East Indies. And at about the same time, at the turn of the 20th century, 1900, we have the American-Spanish War. And this is fought in Havana, in Cuba, and more people die out of it because of yellow fever than of any other reason. And it is during this period that the first consent form is written. It is written by Walter Reed, all right, who sets up this famous infectious disease hospital. And Walter Reed says that if you are willing to be bitten by mosquitoes which likely carry yellow fever, you will get, you write up the consent form, you sign it, and if you allow yourself to be bitten, you will get $100. This is 1900. $100. And if you get yellow fever, you'll get 100 more. All right? Now you can imagine there were nurses working in this whole thing, and they were getting $10. So you can imagine there were people who actually volunteered for this and died because of yellow fever as a part of it. So while the idea of consent and compensation, I don't know whether it was proportionate or not, but developed out of this, it actually also led to certain problems. And it was also important in the history of yellow fever because what came to the fore was this whole notion of self-experimentation. Is it okay to experiment on yourself? And one of the people who experimented on himself was a man called Lazier, who was a part of this team. he subjects himself to the to the mosquito. He writes to his wife, "I am on the verge of finding out what is happening." And about 2 weeks later, he is dead. All right, he does not actually tell his wife what he's done, but historians, very carefully constructing this, will suggest that he actually subjected himself to the mosquitoes, developed yellow fever, and died, and never wrote it down in any of his writings, because he had already taken out his medical insurance, which would not have gone to his wife. All right. So, but it does raise the whole issue of self-experimentation. Again, and I'll show you later, there are many wonderful things which have come out of self-experimentation. Do we accept them or don't we? Do we allow self-experimentation to occur? People suggest that people who experiment on themselves are more likely to be aware of what they're going to do. On the other hand, they will be more likely to do something that others will not agree to do. During this entire period, there was one bastion which was not breached, and that was the mind and the brain. We just could not get to it. And psychiatry had to deal with a terrible phase where a lot of schools of thought developed, a lot of controversies developed. People set up schools, broke away from them, but people were unconvinced that there was actually a way in which you could treat psychiatric illness. And then along comes a Portuguese neurosurgeon called Egas Moniz. And Egas Moniz, looks at all these problems, and then he says, up here in your brain, in the prefrontal cortex, is where you process all these abstract things, right? And this is where the seat of behavior. So if we have to deal with violent people or people who have long-standing psychiatric, maybe we just disassociate this part of the brain from the rest. That is the birth of psychosurgery, all right? And if you read his own account, he talks about a 63-year-old woman who was, this is case 1, 63-year-old woman, 1936. And he operates on her, he does this lobotomy or leucotomy. And then the next day, she answers questions, first in monosyllables, then more in detail. Are you content to stay here? Her answer, yes. Do you have any of your old fears? No. What were you afraid of? I don't know. I seem to forget. Do you remember being upset when you came here? Yes, I was quite upset, wasn't I? What was it all about? I don't know. I seem to have forgotten. It doesn't seem important now. And it was these sort of narratives which actually propelled psychosurgery. This is why finally, when you have these two schools in India, the Ranchi Mental Hospital and the hospital in Bangalore, it is the Bangalore hospital which takes up psychosurgery in a major way, why psychotherapy becomes the sort of norm in Ranchi. All right. I think from a social point of view, wider ethics, there is also the important story of Pinel. All right. Pinel, during the French Revolution, it was common practice when people were not mentally sound, or very often when they were in line for an inheritance, to declare them insane and then get them sent to a mental asylum where they were shackled. Among some of the remarkable things which happened out of the French Revolution, which was in itself quite bloody and violent in any way, was that Pinel goes up to the mental asylums in France and he breaks the chains. It is a dramatic moment. And it's a dramatic moment because it will presage this movement in the rest of the world by over 100 years. He actually is saying to people that people shouldn't be all just contained and confined for life without any foreseeable future in a mental asylum and tied and chained because people do not understand what they are going through. Okay. This section is on the advent of surgery. The advent of surgery actually has its roots in the understanding of anatomy. Can you just get my file? No, the file. I may also have to sit. I was not there. That's why I'm moving around and making sure I don't.
You need a chair.
I don't suddenly. Oh, is that for me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, the advent of surgery has its roots in the barber surgeons who surgery was always considered a dirty business of medicine. And that is why you had the barbers doing the surgery first, right? Physicians were learned people. They went to university. They studied logic, Latin, Greek, astronomy, which in some strange way made them fit to treat people, all right? And barber surgeons were people who were barbers. They carried pliers in their pockets, removed teeth, they incised abscesses, and for some reason, although they did the greater good, they were considered, a manual trade, therefore not worthy of sitting or standing anywhere near the presence of a physician. But there were great barber surgeons, and in this panel here, you'll see a barber surgeon called Ambrose Paré, who was a barber surgeon who worked with the French army, and at a time when surgery was dictated by dogma, so they had battle wounds which were terrible, people were bleeding, and the method at that time was that if a person was really bleeding badly, you had to stop the bleeding. And you did that by cauterizing the wound, by pouring hot oil into the wound. So it burnt everything, it stopped the bleeding. And one day, Paré's oil runs out. And with trepidation, he then decides to apply a salve. And he also does something else remarkable. I've forgotten what he uses, what gut. He ties off the artery, and the ligature is born. The next day, he prays through the night, and he says, I go to the patient with trepidation for what I have done. Will I ever be able to face this patient again? And when he walks in, he finds people crying in pain. They've all been cauterized, but his patient sleeping soundly. Barber surgeons had to really do the work that no one else wanted to do. And in the great Massachusetts General Hospital, they performed one surgery a month. And that surgery was performed with 4 huge people bringing in a heavy chair. A person alcohol would be poured down the person's throat until he was insensible, dragged to the chair, tied down. And even in that state, people would describe, there are eyewitnesses to it, people would describe the horror and the panic in those people's eyes before they were operated. There is an eyewitness account of John Warren. John Warren, who is the premier surgeon in Massachusetts General Hospital. And there is a man who's come with a tumor of the tongue. So he's brought in, he's tied down. John Warren is a stoic man. He stands upright. He's actually depicted here in this picture with his hand behind his back. He goes up to the patient and says, your tongue. And as though completely mesmerized, the patient sticks out his tongue. John Warren grasps the tongue and with one movement slices off the tumor. He bleeds, and as the patient screams, a hot iron rod is applied to stem the flow of blood. You're all sitting. Thank you. Okay. That was surgery. That was surgery. And in order for it to change, several things had to happen. Anesthesia had to be discovered, that Morton and Wells discovered. They come in with ether to this very dome where Warren had done that earlier surgery. And as with every time when people come in to do the surgery, there were heaps of medical students and young doctors who would all come in. It was their entertainment for the day, because people would come and they would all get this spiel about, we've got something which will allow you to painless surgery, and then finally the first cut would make, there'd be a yelp and everyone would burst into laughter. And on that day Morton comes in late. John Warren is not a person who takes kindly to that. But Morton immediately flusters around and delivers his ether. John Warren makes an incision. There is I think it is a gland in the neck. He makes the incision. There is not a sound. He removes it. Not a sound. It comes out. At the end of it, this stoic, phlegmatic man, who had to be phlegmatic to do all the surgery he does, eyewitness account of the person who's there, says, the man, you see John Warren with tears streaming down his eyes, and he makes this announcement to everyone. Gentlemen, this is no humbug. This is no humbug. And that changed the face of surgery. And if you look at the records after anesthesia, from once a month, the records jump up to once every day. It's a huge leap. But it also needed blood transfusions. Although Landsteiner discovers the blood groups in 2000, no blood transfusions occur. It requires a huge cataclysmic event for transfusions to be used, and that cataclysmic event is the First World War. It is the war which kills more people in the military than the Second World War. More civilians died in the Second World War. Weapons of mass destruction were used for the first time, apart from the fact that you had stupid generals coming out of public schools in Britain, actually sending hordes of people across the trenches in what they believed was a war of attrition. So that on a single day in the Battle of Somme, 60,000 people would die just running over the trenches, advancing 20 meters and being shot to bits by machine guns. But by 1917 it became clear that shock which was being described in the battlefields was actually due to blood loss. And so in 1917, field units of blood transfusion started appearing. And finally, the next big event which changed surgery was antibiotics. The discovery by Fleming of penicillin. And I think this is important. It has several ramifications. You would think penicillin had such a wonderful thing. I mean, many people look at Alexander Fleming as a sloppy microbiologist, right? He didn't put his petri dish fully into a bucket of disinfectant, went on a holiday, comes back and sees penicillium mold growing. And in fact, people suggest that if it wasn't for Florian Chain, who actually discovered suggested what the implications of penicillin were, the first thought of Fleming was, wonderful, this is a nice way to clean petri dishes because all the bacteria disappear. So, but one of the first things that happens when they discover the importance of penicillin is, how do we get penicillin going so that it becomes available? And what is remarkable is that when they decide to produce penicillin, there are private companies which come and put their offers, and they are refused. The first batches of penicillin are made with public funding through public industry. All right? And that is to ensure accessibility and affordability to all. But penicillin has a terrible history, because as you all know, penicillin is then mired in a whole series of ethical issues. So we have the famous Tuskegee study, where once penicillin is discovered, you have these black Americans who have syphilis, who are followed for the natural cause of syphilis and not put on penicillin even after it becomes available. But we also know, for instance, that in the generation of penicillin, the studies to show its efficacy were done in prisons, like the Sing Sing prison. So should we discard it as being unethical? Should we? These are, because I think we sometimes become selective in our outreach when we want to say that, there are some things which are terrible and we should not do. But things which are definitely very good, we tend to keep quiet about. The man who did the Tuskegee studies came to India, John Cutler. In 1949, he writes a report for the government of Bengal where he advocates the use of penicillin for all those who have syphilis without any moral consideration. Goes back to America, conducts the Tuskegee study and doesn't give the penicillin to those people there. They go on, and that's a United States Public Health Service project. In the 1940s, they go to Guatemala. 6,000 people are experimented upon. They're actually infected. They are made syphilitic. Some of them are started on penicillin. They are discontinued because it is too expensive. Clinton apologizes for Tuskegee. Barack Obama apologizes for Guatemala. In any case, America is sued. All right? They are sued because they are still survivors of the Guatemala experiment. All right? Which occurred. And John Cutler, who was running the Tuskegee, in the 1950s develops the largest database for the use of penicillin throughout the world. If you look at the bulletins of WHO and you go through the 1950s, you will see a whole collation of articles on the use of penicillin and its use in syphilis. All right? Thank you. Okay, so here we have a gentleman, all right? And this gentleman is the plague physician. The Black Death of Europe decimated the population of Europe. It killed a third of Europe. And in the midst of this, you had entire cities affected by the plague, and the physician clothed himself like this in order to take care of his patients. He had this beak. That is because plague was believed to come from the humors. Within this beak were placed herbs so that the air would be purified. He carried with himself a posy which he would periodically sniff, all right? He was covered from head to toe, carried a cane, because although the idea of contagion did not exist, he would not touch. He would use the cane to examine. And did the plague physician die? Yes, he died. He died because in this whole garment there was a fatal flaw. And the flaw was here. He wore velvet shoes and the fleas from the rats hit him here. Alright? And so he died. I raise this issue because it actually raises an important ethical question of duty to care. What is the duty of the physician when there is an epidemic? When there is a disease which cannot be treated? At that time it could not be treated. The same ethical dilemma was debated during the Ebola outbreak in Africa. During this time, physicians were quite heroic. I mean, they went around, they died almost with as much frequency as the general population, except that they frightened a lot more to death because there are people who describe that, the very sight of this physician walking along the streets was like a harbinger of death. It meant that death could not be far behind. All right? And I think for me the plague also raises the questions of how do we respond to an unknown menace. All right? In history there are repeated examples of this. All right? The earliest examples are those of leprosy. All right? the leprosy patient confined in the biblical sense had to ring the bell so that everyone could get out of the way. And then they confined to islands. And it is unfortunate actually that Father Damien went to the island and contracted leprosy. If he had gone to the island and never contracted leprosy, the social stigma would probably have been less. Was his work heroic? Yes. He went and decided to go and work with leprosy patients at a time when no one else was willing to do. Unfortunately, he contracted leprosy. But it constantly raises this issue about what is an ethical response to an unknown disease or an unknown event. And that unknown event for the West occurred not only with the plague, it occurred with cholera. India was the birthplace of cholera. The swamps and tanks of Bengal where dying bodies would be thrown were the nidus for the spread of cholera. And Rudyard Kipling would write his poems and say, that famous poem of, and they all moved on and 100 men dead. The army trying to go ahead of cholera and constantly dropping people because of it, because of the outbreak of cholera. And cholera spreads through, and it reaches Central Asia. And in what is today Tehran, in Persia, the man, it talks about the ethical response of rulers. What does the ruler, the king of Persia do? He closes the gates of Tehran. And cholera moves all around. And it decimates everyone, but the city is spared. And so is the ruler. And Europe waits with bated breath because they don't know what's going to happen next. They can see it slowly advancing towards Europe. And it finally reaches a crisis when it reaches Russia. And in Russia, okay, now the white man is going to be affected by cholera. Already Nicholas I, the Tsar before Nicholas II, who is already under pressure. No one likes the Tsar in any case. And the riots, food riots break out. And Nicholas I decides he has to show to his people that I am one with you. And so cholera has reached, he goes out and visits patients who have died of cholera. Quite remarkable, given the fact that they didn't know what to do. The British ambassador writes to Russia and says, we must do something about this. Surely you have prisoners who could die for a greater cause. Ask them to share the bed linen of those who have died with cholera, and we will soon know what causes it. To the credit of Russia, they refuse. And so it moves on and it reaches Vienna. And as it reaches Vienna, it strikes the most crowded parts of the city, which is the Jewish quarter. Again, the British ambassador responds, racial responses, writes, it is no doubt that we will have to bear the brunt of this because of the dirty, filthy Jews. All right? So they have already decided what horror. And then what does Britain do? As it reaches the English Channel, Britain closes its ports. They close their ports, they decide they will not allow. But Britain is a mercantile nation. It cannot do without trade. And so finally what they do, at some stage they open the ports. And what happens when they open the ports? Cholera comes in and people start dying. What is the response of the government? There are suddenly reports saying cholera has reached. The government says, no, it is not cholera. They died because so-and-so was old. This person died because she was neglected. That person died with it. And by the time the government acknowledges that cholera has reached, it has already become an epidemic. And it has become an epidemic when funerals will have to be rationed out because there are not enough people to bury the victims of cholera. So I think it actually is a wonderful story because it actually forces us to actually debate the ethical response of doctors, the ethical response of the state, all right, in response to epidemics and pandemics like this.
Madhu, I think we did something like this in 89. The first HIV positive FNAC that was done in the tax department was done in isolation ward. Many people from the tax department were there. We gowned up, gloved up, had masks. Microbiology faculty was in attendance. Everyone gloved up, gowned up, and someone says, she doesn't have goggles. It's better if someone with specs does it. Unglove, the next person gloves up, gowns up, and the effort was done. It was 89.
Yeah. No, but actually right now people have actually come up with ethical guidelines for use during these things with relation to duty to care. I mean, the fact is that...
I mean, that can be
yeah.
something.
No, but even now with new outbreaks, people don't know what to do. It's not as a similar thing. So people have come up with that fact that physicians need, healthcare workers have to be protected. And then if they aren't protected and if they are sick, there is no duty to just go out and kill yourself. I mean, there is a duty to care which also goes to the physician. I mean, there have to be reasonable measures which are put in place based on what you know to protect the physician as well, so that they can become effective in protecting our people.
I think what is different is that even now we know the awards that mostly when we happens to the reason that lets us speak barriers.
Yeah, but it still becomes an issue when, if you look at the response to Ebola, for instance, wherever the international response was, the type of protection for healthcare workers was quite different from what healthcare workers in the country were actually able to work. So that, I mean, it was, so I think the point that people are making is that you need to ensure, so even when new vaccines are developed, who should be vaccinated first? Very often it is healthcare personnel who are selectively vaccinated initially, and those at risk before the general population, because they are going to have to deal with the problem in the academic risk. So this section is actually devoted to in search of cures. And we have, whenever you want, you are most welcome to come here and spend time, because actually I think there is a lot here that can be said and done, but I'm just looking at my watch and I think I've talked too much. But anyway, the pharmacy, we all know that if we buy Whitfield's ointment now, how much does a tube cost? Yeah. And how much does it actually cost to make less than 2 rupees? All right, and it's not rocket science. It can be done, but it can't be sold without those labels. All right, so it becomes a big problem to actually make care accessible to people. I thought I would start off this section to recognize again Major General Bhatia. All right, because Major General Bhatia. Today we talk about affordable care and we talk about accessibility and all that. At the time of independence, India was importing aspirin. Alright? If we have reached a stage where we have got such a huge generic industry going, it is actually because of people like S.L. Bhatia. I'll say it only once. Who was a physiologist, right? Because we often asked what purpose we serve, all right? So, no, not once in a sentence. I'll end it that way, okay? He was the chair of the Pharmaceutical Inquiry Committee, a committee which was instituted by the government of India to ensure that we could provide medications to everyone at a cost that they could afford. And it is an extremely remarkable document because it's very detailed in its thing, but it addresses this whole idea that we have to get the pharmaceutical industry going. And of course, he was very much in favor, and rightly so I think, of government taking responsibility for this, which is why you have the CFTRI and all that developing, all right? Not CFTRI, CDR, Central Drug and Research Institute. All right. So this is his report which he comes out with. All right. And I just thought I'd mention it because part of public health ethics is certainly affordability and accessibility to healthcare. But how do we do studies on drugs which are actually ethical and all that? I shan't go into all the things that we know. But there are two people I want to remember. And unfortunately, I was unable to trace my copy of Human Guinea Pigs by Papworth. All right? In the 1960s, two people wrote very influential books. And they also wrote very influential articles. One was Papworth in the United Kingdom, and the other person was Beecher in America. What they observed was, this was in the 1960s. We all keep talking about the Nuremberg Code like it was the code which changed all of mankind. I'll come to that later. All right? But after the code was passed in 1948, you've got to ask yourself, why did it take so long to pass a 10-point code? It was because for close to 3 years, America and Britain, following the trial, Nuremberg trial, the doctor's trial, could not agree on what to put in that code. And they could not agree because they themselves were conducting experiments in their own countries which were in gross violation of that code and were in some instances as bad as the Nazi experiments in Germany. So was this really the remarkable code that it was, or was it merely a stamp of the victors on the vanquished to tell you that this is something you did very badly and now we are going to make sure we rub it in your noses? And I'll come to that later, because if we accept the Nuremberg Code for just what it is and say that we're actually doing a great disservice to what actually happened. Once the Nuremberg Code was passed, there was a move. It was in Britain. For 10 consecutive weeks, there was a laboratory technician in a hospital who sent the Nuremberg Code to the Minister of Health and to the NHS every week for 10 weeks, asking them to incorporate the code into the NHS. They said, will the NHS accept the code as part of experimentation that is happening? And there was no response. In fact, Britain continued to do those studies well into the 60s. When Papworth published his work called The Human Guinea Pigs, he went through 4 publishers and all refused to to publish it because they felt that it was just too much. They'd have to bear the brunt of it. Papworth and Beecher in America were in constant touch with each other. And so Papworth provides to Beecher 7 cases, and Beecher then publishes his famous paper in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1966. Both these people are finally responsible for the creation of ethics research committees, institutional ethics research committees. But if you read the story behind the story, you will realize that they really struggled to get this passed. And as late as the 70s in America, studies on prisoners continued to be done. What type of studies? Testicles were being irradiated. Repeated biopsies were being taken. They were being infected with infectious agents. Only in 1978, 30 years after the Nuremberg Code, was a decision taken that prison experiments would not take place. So I think one of the problems for me that I have when we quote history is if we just look at these as items on a slide, we tend not to actually appreciate the fact that there were many exclusions to this, that this wasn't the event which suddenly changed history as we make it out to be, that there was a continued effort of many people to ensure that experiments continue to be done ethically.
But there's also an interesting thing here about the hierarchy of people.
that how can you question people who are the big doctors, who are doing
Yeah.
experiments,
Yeah.
the good scientists. So therefore, I think Beecher, it seems like, was not so senior. So whether it's
No,
public...
it is in Papworth's study that he brings this out. That
in
many
Papworth,
that
that's
many
right.
people actually refused to actually question any of their seniors because they felt that they would be their careers would be torn to shreds, and that would be the end of it. So
this issue of litigation is important. That's interesting. It is still there today. No? So,
Who has culture? It still exists.
There's this whole issue about seeking an apology for Agent Orange, which was essentially an experimental weapon of mass destruction.
yeah.
The Americans have never acknowledged to the Vietnamese that this was bad. Only to their own soldiers have they finally done that.
Yes, but actually,
Very good.
but you know something, that is the repeat. That is why I say that was it a history, was it ethics that emerges, or was it actually the stamp of the victor on the vanquished? I'm not saying we didn't benefit from it, but I'm saying we do a disservice when we try to assign to certain people the high moral values that we. By the way, Germany had far better ethical codes than anyone else. In fact, the ethical codes of Nuremberg were derived from German codes, which existed before. None of the countries, America, Britain, had ethics codes. So this right here is a man called Albert Neisser. All right, we've forgotten about him. Neisser was the man who discovered gonorrhea. What is it? Neisseria gonorrhea. Yeah, and he was arguably the second biggest scientist in Germany after Robert Koch. But what he did was, it was the age of serum therapy, and they believed that serum therapy would cure everything. So he takes the serum of people with syphilis, and then he injects it into prostitutes, and after some time they develop syphilis, and Neisser says, it was not because of me, they were prostitutes, for crying out loud. All right? But to the credit of Germany, despite the fact that he was held in such high standing, he is actually taken to task, and he is, I think, banned for some time and punished and all that. But
He's fine.
yeah, he's fined. Sorry, he's fined, and then but in 1900, and everyone has forgotten this, the first directives for research is actually developed, and they are called the Prussian Code. It developed in 1900 in direct response to Neisser. It is there that you will find the whole idea of informed consent, that you will not do experiment on minors, that you will look at risks and benefits. A lot of the things which later on happened find their roots in Neisser in 1900, and that's not the end of it. The Lubeck disaster in the late 1920s, where children are injected with mycobacterium rather than the BCG, leads to a huge disaster and deaths. And in response to that, there is a further code called the Reich Regulations, which occur in 1933, around early 30s. And that further reinforces the code. So there was Germany with the best codes in the world, okay, to govern research, and yet goes on into the Nazi war crimes. And I think that the reason I mention this is because, again, for some reason we have not we've forgotten about a lot of the issues which actually give rise to our guidelines. It was not the Americans and the British who developed our guidelines. They derived their guidelines a lot from earlier events. If you look at the language, you will see that they are so closely linked to the events which occurred before. It also tells us the sobering thought that codes do not make us more ethical. All right? Codes do not make us more ethical. Because Germany had a surfeit of codes, and yet they went into all these trials. But if we are to judge Germany, and we should, because the Nazi war crimes in Germany were without doubt horrendous, then why is it that The world has completely forgotten Unit 731. How many of you all have heard of Unit 731? Unit 731 were the experiments that were done by the Japanese in China. Alright? With a staff of more than 10,000, it had 731 units, 3,000 people exterminated. Alright? The type of experiments that they did were no less than what was done in Nazi Germany. How many of us even talk about it? Why don't we talk about it? Because when these came to light, alright, General MacArthur, who was in charge of the program in Germany, in Japan after the World War, said, I want all that has come out of Unit 731. And then gave an amnesty. So we have forgotten about it. Those people, I think, also need to be remembered. Which is why I love history. Because we keep forgetting. Alright? And why we need to remember them is because they die more than twice. They died because of the experiments, they die when we forget them, and we die when we quote the experiments that were done on them to think. And yet, America granted the Japanese amnesty in return for all the data derived out of 731. Alright? And even today, if you go and look, you will find that it is only now emerging about all these atrocities. The scale of these atrocities are not in any way less than the atrocities of Nazi Germany. There are people who have been interviewed, who are survivors, who are part of those camps, the experimenters, who talk about vivisection that was done. Surgery was done on people without anesthesia. Why? They were subjected to plague. They experimented with plague bombs. They would drop these plague bombs from aircraft to see, did it cause the plague? Our short answer, yes it did. Alright? And when people were exposed, they were then operated without anesthesia. Why? In order to ensure, because they didn't want anesthesia to interfere with the results. So when you read all this, I think that the pitch that I'm making is that there is every reason why every doctor needs to study history. History of medicine. We are here. For a start, some of you all know we are here, so that's a good thing. But I think that it does raise a lot of issues beyond the superficiality which we often deal with these sort of events. Alright? There is a huge coming to terms which is demanded by events like this. To forget them completely is actually such a tragedy. I mean, I often ask myself, if it was my family member who was subjected to this, to be then confined to, complete darkness, never ever to be remembered. I mean, how much is that ethical? Is remembrance itself not ethical? Okay, I will end with two quick things and then we will stop. What our students take an oath when they finish medicine is not the Hippocratic Oath. It's the Declaration of Geneva. Alright? The Declaration of Geneva derived from the International Code of Medical Ethics, which also describes the duties of the doctors and the duties of the doctors in general, to the sick, to each other. And then there is this Declaration of Geneva, which forms what we keep calling the Hippocratic Oath. The World Medical Association was actually responsible for trying to internationalize a code of ethics for doctors. And in this 1950 report, you will find that they did a survey to find out how many people actually took an oath, and they didn't in many countries like Australia, Belgium, China, Ireland, India. What's also interesting is that India had the lowest age at which you could enter in medical school. Okay? But I think there is a whole history which goes around oaths, alright? And how it evolved and what were the changes that came about from time to time, which we have material on. And of course, in India itself, we have a very old tradition of medicine, and we have our own oaths which we use. And the most common oath which we are all familiar with is the oath of initiation by Charaka. But what we also need to know is that the Sushruta Samhita also had oaths. There were also oaths of a convocation. Alright? And these are not things which we have not actually. There was a need for registration of doctors. It was required of the physician that he meet the king, and only after approval will he practice medicine. And one of the people who has actually studied this extensively is the wife of Bhatia, who we have in history medicine, called Bangalore. She has actually focused on Indian medicine, and in particular, this very well-written book called Well-Mannered Medicine, Medical Ethics and Etiquette in Classic Ayurveda. And for those of you all who are interested, if you're actually getting it, is worthwhile reading it, because she deals with a host of issues in a really, really nice and readable style. I mean, is this ethics of Ayurveda still relevant? And then she goes on to discuss. I'm trying to find the page that I want. She discusses on becoming a physician, on continued learning and interaction with peers, to care or not to care, the rewards of medical practice, the necessity in the doctor-patient relationship. There's so much that actually has to be extracted out of these texts that we have. Thank you.